Mile 53 from Radville, on what Canadian National called its Avonlea sub, Radville to Moose Jaw, 88.3 miles. The Canadian Northern Railway laid this road in 1911-1912, a distant extension of their so-called literary line. Canadian Northern, of course, became a cornerstone of Canadian National Railways in 1917. These rails, since 1989, belong to the Southern Rails Co-op, or headquartered down there in Avonlea, about a mile away. We're looking southeast, and the rails still extend about another 9 miles out beyond Avonlea to Truax. The rails between Truax and Radville are long gone. The line was likely abandoned down there by CN about the time it sold its northern portion to Southern Rails Co-op. Looking off to the south, panning around to catch the southeastern corner of the dirt hills. Undifferentiated and stagnant ice moraine, dark brown loam piled up 220 meters above the surrounding plains. Sort of a vanguard for the Missouri Coteau, the third prairie step beyond. Right over there is Claybank and its famous interpretive center in the old Dominion Fire brick plant south of town. It's springtime, and this is Gravelbourg Junction. Looking northwestward towards Moose Jaw and its air base, 35 miles away. And you can see the crossing of Range Road 233 west of the 2nd Meridian, right there. And looking down on that same crossing and northwest towards Hearn and round the Dog Leg up there, about 5 miles. And this is the vast flat expanse of the Regina Plains, the bed of Glacial Lake Regina. This part of the lake drained into the Capel system maybe 10,000 years ago. The rest of the lake drained down through the Souris into the Missouri system and into the Gulf. These are mostly dark brown clay soils, also called gumbo, great farmland, but heavy and too hard to work before the introduction of steam traction engines and giant braking plows about the end of the 19th century. 24 miles north of Belle Plaine and Pence is the Canadian Pacific Main Line, completed 1882 through this neighborhood. Closer in, 13 miles to the north, is Drinkwater on the Canadian Pacific Soo Line, completed in 1893 from Northgate on the American boundary through to Pasco on the main line near Moose Jaw. And coming around southeast to look over Avonlea. This is the RM of Ellsthorpe, number 100, the headquarters of which is in Avonlea there. It was incorporated December the 12th, 1910. Farming settlers began arriving in this area at the end of the 19th century, and most had British surnames. Mrs. Lydia Mitchell opened the first post office for them, August 1st, 1904. She called it Avonlea, and it was in her homestead farmhouse about a mile north of the junction here. The office was moved on to the town site in 1912 and it's been there ever since. Along the rail line there you can see the beginnings of the divergence off to the right there, heading west. Canadian Northern surveyed this line in 1911 as they were laying down the Avonlea sub. They had steel on it by 1913 out to Gravelbourg, 78.5 rail miles away, crossing the CPR's Expanse subdivision at Mossbank. You can see the trace of it there heading westward to Claybank, 7.3 rail miles away, and the Dominion Fire brick plant just south of there. To reach across to Claybank was the last remnant of CN's Gravelbourg sub. I would reckon that it was pulled up in the 1990s or early 2000s. There's the northern leg of the Y. Canadian Northern never built any farther than Gravelbourg. However, the sub was pushed out through Hodgeville and out to Swift Current, 150.6 miles from the junction by Canadian National in the 1920s. It was soon retracted to Needpath, the end of the steel for years, before it was again retracted to Hodgeville. In a rationalization of assets in 1987, CP ended up controlling that part of the Gravelbourg sub west from Mossbank. The company issued a notice of abandonment in 2006 and a notification of discontinuance in 2014. 1 year later, they began retracting the rails eastward from Hodgeville, and they've all been lifted now. That portion of the sub between Moss Bank and Gravelbourg Junction was abandoned piecemeal. Likely the piece between Moss Bank and Spring Valley was abandoned in 1987. Not sure when the rest of it was shut down. Another look at the dirt hills. Trevor Harriott, in his book A River in a Dry Land, mentions that it was a favorite lookout for Métis and First Nations buffalo hunters. There are traces of Yvernon settlements up there over winter camps. This is Treaty 4 territory, the main of which was signed on September the 15th, 1874 at Fort Qu'Appelle, hence it's called the Qu'Appelle Treaty. The Cree, the Saulteaux, and the Assiniboia signed, and on behalf of the Queen, Alexander Morris, the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba, and David Laird, the Minister of the Interior, signed. They agreed to share the territory, but the First Nations were shocked at the changes to their ancient buffalo hunting ground wrought by the newcomers in just a few short decades. Gravelbourg Junction, Saskatchewan.